Okay, in this talk I'm going to go through 3 different claims. The first one is quite weak. I expect that it's pretty uncontroversial. The last one's a bit weirder. So the scenario is you are writing a paper concerning a simulation that you have made, and you are talking about a phenomena that emerge from it. You're talking about, I've made the simulation, but I've noticed that this happens. So, claim number 1, the paper should have your simulation embedded in it. By which I mean that we should move beyond just having pictures of our simulations and should think about actually having the simulation there, not even videos. This will allow the community to understand your simulation better and to check its consistency and its honesty. I'll be okay, already a little bit controversial. Could we talk about it at the end, because if that one's controversial, then the next ones will be completely insane.
I'm just trying to.
Yeah. Okay. The audience should be able to discover the phenomenon themselves. By which I mean, I made the simulation. You're saying I've made the simulation. I've noticed that so and so happens. I've noticed that a spiral can form on this reaction-diffusion thing. The audience should be able to play around with the simulation as you see it and reproduce that phenomenon that you have noticed by manipulating the simulation as you have presented it. And if they can't do that, it is reasonable for people to be skeptical of your claim, and it is not a surprise if people misunderstand your claim that such and such a phenomena emerges from such and such a simulation. The weirdest one is number 3, interacting with the simulation. So we're imagining someone's reading a paper that you've written, and they're both reading things that you've written and they're interacting with some simulation. Interacting with the simulation rather than reading the words should be thought of as the main way to understand your paper's content, because words are prone to dishonesty and sloppiness.
It's Wittgenstein problem again.
Controlling the audience's experience by being selective about metrics, by which I mean sort of outputs of your simulation, and initial conditions can make it so that words may not have to be used at all in presenting your simulation. Okay, so claim number 1, I'm going to go through each of these parts. Claim number 1, so embedding simulations in a paper. This was a video put out by the Jensen lab. Does anybody know these folks? Electron microscopy. I think they're mostly electron microscopy, but oh dear. That should play, come on. Yeah, okay, good. This is a 20-minute long video that they made. It's not an outreach video. So far as I can tell, it is it's a video that I think you guys would be quite interested in. It's coarse-grained stuff. They go through this. They go through a bunch of pictures. They have words overlaid on the pictures. It's good stuff. They talk about reasonable assumptions one can make at different points in the video, but they also have these simulations in the video. All the simulations that they have, they put in there, and they talk about different ways that they change the model, different things that you can have. It's really interesting stuff, and they communicate it. There's no sound to this that I'm cutting out. It's communicated in large part visually, and they've got all these simulations.
So what's that, bacterial growth?
Bacterial growth, yeah, elongation and eventually splitting into.
So what do they use for this?
What do they use for it? To create the video? I don't know. Oh, what's the simulation package? I'm afraid I don't know.
Presumably.
Possibly, I don't know. But it's good stuff. Yep. They go through really every aspect, as far as I can tell, every aspect of it. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure why they made this. Actually, it's pretty interesting because it clearly communicates their research very well, but it's not it's just a video on YouTube. It's not a publication in a journal. It is a 20-minute video, and it probably took them some effort to make this thing. But that's not precisely what I was talking about. That's sort of something to whet your appetite for something else, which I'm going to go to here. So this is more like outreach. This is an article that you can read on the internet, Parable of the Polygons. It's about sociology. It's not about biology, but I think it's quite applicable. It's got these little cartoon characters, and you can interact with something here. I just pick up a triangle and I put it into there. And I can move these things around. A triangle that is next to lots of squares is a little bit unhappy. It prefers to be with other triangles. And it has, more interactive stuff. You're interacting with a simulation here, basically. Just a simulation of how much the shapes like to be around each other. And what the whole paper has an argument that it's presenting you with these simulations. Here is a part where it sort of happens automatically. You get a little metric on the right. I'm not going to talk about the content of the paper, just the method of presentation, right? You're controlling a parameter of the simulation here. You can change it and do more. It's quite cool. The simulation gets more and more sophisticated. So over here you've got 4 different parameters that you can control, and it's interesting. So it alternates between words and simulations of increasing sophistication. It's good stuff. But like I say, it's outreach. It's not a proper scientific publication. But it was based on a scientific publication, almost all of it. Okay. So there's that. And then there's some things that I've made. So basically, I was quite inspired by this. I was also thinking about it before, but this came out when I was working in sort of the games industry, and there are other things like it, and yeah. I was even so something that I showed Ivan was something like that, but in virtual reality. So I was giving a lecture while I was in virtual reality, and I was interacting with. I was showing pictures, but I was also interacting with sort of simulations myself. Okay, let's get back to the proper presentation. No. So, over the last sort of 30 years, well, I suppose 20 years of computers, we've had increasing bandwidth, by which I literally mean internet speed, but I also mean increasing capabilities to some extent. So, a PDF document has fewer capabilities than an HTML document. For example, so you download from nature.com, you download a PDF of a paper. It has references, but the references are not hyperlinks. That is something that an HTML page has over on this. And I think we all agree that hyperlinks are at least a little bit more convenient than references. That's a simple one. We also have increasing bandwidth. We can now watch lectures on YouTube of the whole scientific community that we might be in. The other nice thing about an HTML page is, for example, that you can have comments underneath. And you can download the comments that were on a scientific paper, again from nature.com, like in PDF format, but this HTML is designed for comments, so XHTML is designed for comments, and that's nice. And here we have something else. I'm going to come out of it again. So there's this bunch of web pages called Observable, and these are a little bit like a cross between a web page and like a Mathematica or a MATLAB downloadable file. So you've got some words, and very similar to what we saw before. You can scroll down, and you can very easily set up just a slider that interacts with some simulation, some partial differential equations in the case of this one, and you can. It's almost like a notebook. You can just write things down, write in some equations. You can easily see the code that's behind this thing. It's a very nice format. Not perfect. They're still working on it. This is like very recent. But yeah. So increasing bandwidth, increasing stuff that you can say with different file formats. So that had to be a JavaScript file. It's one step up from HTML, which is sort of one step up from PDF or PowerPoint files. And basically, so yeah, with all of this, all I've been saying is it would be nice if those of us working on simulations could make something like observable, could make it so that any simulation that you present is immediately something that the user, that the audience / reader can interact with while reading your paper. I feel like that might be uncontroversial. Like that it would be nice if you could have that.
This is already happening.
Yeah. One objection. I was talking about this with Ivan, and he pointed out that the fairly obvious thing, which is that simulations require lots of CPU resources. But we were talking, and now you can open up a browser window on a laptop, and it can be connected to a high-powered server. And so the idea of having to purchase a powerful piece of, a powerful laptop or a powerful computer, that might be on its way out, potentially. There's a quote here from a guy called Jerry Sussman, who is, I think, an important computing pioneer. In future, it's going to be such that computers are so cheap and so easy to make that you can make them the size of a grain of sand and complete with a megabyte of RAM, and you're going to pour them into your concrete. So the building will have lots of CPU resources, and so thinking of a person working on simulations as a person who uniquely has access to a large computer that is in the same building as them, that might be on the way out. You guys would know this better than me, but and Ivan pointed out, there's some sense in which, by definition, if you are publishing a paper on simulations, then you are probably a person who has access to more CPU resources than other people. It's possible that that's true by definition. I'd say that it's unfortunate because, it sort of suggests that the only reason you're able to create good research is because, you have this rarefied resource. But yeah, who knows? So that would be a nice thing to talk about. But okay, part 2. Interactive reproducibility. What do I mean by this? This is the part about now that you've got the simulation in front of you, any claim that the writer of a paper would like to make about a phenomenon that emerges from it, something that can be measured within the simulation, and we have noticed that blah, the reader of the paper should be able to see that as well. And if they can't see that themselves, then they have the right to be skeptical. For me, this is connected to education. So verifying that the audience understood something is sort of an unsolved problem. Some people try to pretend that it's not a problem, but it's definitely a problem. Like, I can, right now, for example, I'm saying things, I am not 100% certain that you've understood them. I think that, in this case, I'm pretty confident, actually. But if you're lecturing to undergraduates or something like this...
Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
When I look at the one's papers, right, I don't even have to pretend. It's totally like a...
Yeah. Yes, okay. Well, there's that. But obviously, we would like somebody to understand Ivan's papers, right?
Somebody does. Very few.
I don't want to. I don't want.
No, well, you say okay, but that's exactly.
It's a joke. I think
I know.
you're recorded, so
Yeah,
I think we can discuss it later.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
if you want.
No. Okay, let's discuss it later.
Yeah,
But it is a thing I would like to discuss
All right.
because that is exactly the point. Somebody could have a bunch of impenetrable mathematics that nobody understands, and they could get away with publishing a paper. You know, the way that scientific communities are supposed to work is that if really nobody understands you, then you can't get by. But you know, okay, that's sort of what I'm talking about here. Verifying that the audience understood something is important. If you present a simulation in your paper, or let's imagine it a different way. Something that you could do today, if you wanted to explain something to me about the simulations that you 4 of you are running right now, then you could sit me down at your computer, and you could, and I would say, I don't see how this phenomenon emerged. I don't see how you can be claiming to be measuring this particular thing. To which you would say, well, I'll take you through the code, and I'd say, well, okay, could I I try to interact with the simulation myself. I maybe write some of my own code, and if I can get the phenomenon to emerge from the simulation, there's some sense in which, by definition, I have understood it. If I can get the phenomenon to emerge, there's no other way, sort of saying it. To which you might say, well, that sounds like really hard. Like, my simulations are quite complicated, and do I really have to take you through every single aspect of such that you can get this emergent phenomenon? To which I would say, well, if you can't do that, then I don't understand it. And that's the point of your paper. The purpose of your paper is for people to understand how such and such a phenomenon emerges. And if I'm unable to do that, then it's a good thing. It's a good thing if I'm looking at your simulation and I can't get the phenomenon to emerge. It's good that you have found out that I can't do that, because it means that I have not understood something that you want to communicate to me. Some people write papers. The papers are a bit incomprehensible, but they say, somebody will get it. Somebody's going to understand it. And maybe nobody does in such, at least to the extent that they would like. And if nobody does, well, that's horrible for them, and it's even more horrible that they don't know that nobody understands them. It's good to have a measure of how well people understand something, and that is part of why I'm saying that you should embed simulations in things. Okay. This is maybe an interesting part, but it's the part that I'm least certain about, so that you guys would know more than me. Having more simulations may solve cultural problems, by which I mean possibly cultural problems in biology, for example. I might also mean cultural problems elsewhere, but in biology, we all know the habit that we're in, which is this is something that I stared at a lot when I was looking at the kinetical stuff. Biologists, there's about maybe 100. There's at least 36 different diagrams, all looking like this, all looking something like this, just concerning the kinetical, because every lab that discovers something new about it makes their own diagram. And what are they doing? So you can publish results. You have these blobby diagrams. You also have like interaction networks. I remember Andrew talking a bunch about those. And it is a problem that, this lab produces this blobby diagram, and that lab produces that blobby diagram, and there could be some incompatibility between the two, and how would you know? Or at least, if maybe you could know if you were, it might take a really good biologist, and we might say that's a measure of how good a biologist is, that they can look at these things and stare at them, but it's unfortunate if that is, if noticing inconsistencies in research is contingent upon somebody being a genius. That is a bit of a problem. By which somebody being a genius, by which I mean somebody taking the time to stare at these models and saying, oh, I've just realized after God knows how much time of looking at them that there's some inconsistency with them. That is not really so much of a problem if you have simulations running, because you can see the inconsistencies a bit faster. So you have these vague sort of networks. Okay, so we could potentially make biology more quantitative by doing this, by having more at least giving biologists access to more simulations. I mean, it's possible to do a biology course without ever interacting with one, right? And that is a bit of a problem. And also, you know, more obvious problem, if there's not that many people understanding your simulation, let's say there are a few people, but it's not that many, but your simulation might be really, really important and might be something that lots of biologists would be really interested to know about if only they could understand it. And putting the simulation in there will help people understand it. Also, more compilable code equals more clarification. When you have to run, like the person who made this blobby diagram didn't have to know every single thing there is to know about the kinetochore. They didn't have to know every single thing that's currently in the literature about the kinetochore. And so that's slightly in contrast. If a person tries to write a computer program and they don't understand how the libraries that they're importing work, then they can't write their computer program. You know, the paper in which this blobby diagram is found may have references to a bunch of other papers about the kinetochore, but has the person who's made this blobby diagram completely understood those papers? You know, possibly not. And they're writing it.
Oh, I don't know if I agree with that. I frequently use code which I don't know what it's doing, as far as I have an interface, right? Which I know what it returns to me.
It's true. That's absolutely true. But at least you know that if there was something that you were doing in your own code that referred to that other code that was inconsistent with it in some way, there would be a crash. At least you know, like, the format of the data that the code that you're importing outputs. There's more of a requirement on you to understand it, I would claim. This is a quite nice thing made by a friend of mine. It's quite... you can go for something like this. It's very similar to the kind of diagrams that biologists use to talk about gene regulation or whatever. And
there's Markov chains. Yes.
Is it a Markov chain? I think it might actually be less precise than that.
It's less precise, but it's representation of Markov chain.
Okay. All right, sure. Yeah, you could do the same thing for differential equations at least. Right. Why am I talking about this? Well, if somebody's going to have a diagram like this in a paper, if somebody's going to, you know, they're studying some gene interaction network and they're like, okay, we have this, arrow that ends in a line or whatever, they could at least write it in something like this that you can then interact with, which is a bit different to just having a JPEG of it in your PDF file that is your paper. Right. And finally, part 3, can we communicate solely with simulations? Why on earth would you want to do this, for example? Like, okay, so, you know, in this one, they didn't communicate solely with simulations. They had some clips of simulations that they ran, and they had some words and blobby diagrams to talk about. What? And you had to read the words, and you had to stare at the blobby diagrams, and you had to assimilate a model in your mind. And that model then feeds into your judgment of the simulations that they show you. but you know, I claim that we might be able to do better than that. The reason that you'd want to do better than that is because words, again, I think are sort of inherently a bit sloppy as a method of communication. Reproducibility is better defined for simulations, and that's why I'm phrasing all of this in terms of reproducibility. In code, so okay, to extend the analogy I was making a minute ago, if you compare these two people, folks like you, people working in a theoretical field and communicating their research to one another, versus software developers importing each other's code. And there's a very strong analogy that I'm sure has not escaped you. If you make the analogy of a program or a library is very similar to a model, while the code that creates that program is very similar to the equations or the labeled diagrams or whatever that go into the model. Use cases are sets of initial conditions that you run your simulation with. Features are emergent phenomena. You know, there's some the equations. You say, oh, I've got this reaction-diffusion equation, and it leads to this spiral, and that's your emergent phenomena. With us, with software developers, you write the code and you get the features. Bugs, as in somebody has noticed something that your code does that they don't like, is sort of equivalent to an inconsistency with the data. Trying to get the code to work that you have imported is quite similar to trying to understand the equations that you're reading in some PDF document by your fellow theoretician. Instead of, I talked about this earlier, hyperlinks are kind of analogous to references. Lookup tables are kind of analogous to data. You know, if you have some model that's parameterized, but it doesn't matter. I don't want to take that one super far. Code, we have compilers, and compilers can do things like notice that some value is undefined, which is useful. In science, we now have theorem provers, which are sort of like software that can analyze what your ideas are. Is the suggestion, is my understanding. And we have file formats, and that's sort of analogous to conventions like the right-hand rule or something like this. Yeah, so it breaks down towards the end there, but you know, what I'd say is that software developers, again, can be a little bit more successful, work a bit more efficiently, a little bit more fast than scientists sometimes, because it's the compiler might be the main thing. The compiler is the thing that says, and the possibility of your computer crashing is sort of the thing that says you have done something wrong. In science, there's no, and when you're thinking about somebody else's ideas about your own ideas, there's nothing that says you got something wrong. Would that there was. And if we could make science a bit more like that, then maybe there might be. And to do that, you might having everything as simulations might be one way of doing that, because you wouldn't have to have all these words that you sort of turn into vague ideas in your head. Okay, all right, so that's kind of why it might be an aspiration, but communicating solely with the simulation, like, really? You know, it sounds really hard, but there are new possibilities for visualization. So this is a nice thing that I like a lot. Here we have, gonna come out of here again and go for this one. So this is a reaction-diffusion simulator in the browser. You can change between a few different systems. What I'm doing with my mouse here is I'm manipulating some initial conditions. You can change the parameters of the model. You can change the, oh, don't know what's happened there. Whatever, let's go for it. Yeah. And let's go for, you can change the colors, you can change the representation as well. Which I really like that. And, you know, I'm not aware of people doing this before. That's a three-dimensional version of the same thing, which I think is quite cool. There's some videos of it on YouTube. It's not something you can interact with, though. this is a nice video.
So here I have an electronic circuit that I drew. I'm not quite done drawing it, so let me finish up here. And now we have a working circuit. I mean, I assume it's a working circuit. I don't actually see anything working here. So this is exactly the same as writing code, that we work in this static representation, but what we actually care about is the data, values of the variables, and we can't see that here. Now in a circuit, the variables are the voltages on these different wires. So each of these wires has a voltage that's changing over time, and we have to be able to see that. Now if I was building this circuit on a lab bench, building it physically, I could at least take an oscilloscope and kind of poke around and see what's going on with the wires, what's going on here and here. So at the very least, I should be able to do that. So what I have here is a plot of the voltage on this wire over time. You see it's high, it's low, high, low. So this is clearly oscillating. If I built this physically, also I would actually be able to see the circuit doing something. So in this case, I've got these two LEDs up here. They're LEDs, the lights, presumably they're there for a reason. I can hit play and watch it simulate out in real time. So now you can see what the circuit's doing.
It sort of goes on like that. It's got some other things. So it's got a sort of what we might call the equivalent of an integrated developer environment. This is some code that he's writing, and on the right is something that tracks the internal state of the code, and it sort of automatically updates. It automatically updates the simulation as he is writing the code, which is quite cool. Here's a simple thing where he's just writing some code that draws a picture, and it updates in real time, which is interesting. This is quite a clever one because he has a simulation that's sort of
oh, cool! So you can change rules.
Yeah, you can change the rules, and let's get to it. Yeah, it's easier in the format in which he presents it. It's easier to do what he's doing here for what he's programming here is a video game. It's a bit harder for a scientist to think about how they could make something similar to this for their simulation. So what he's done here is he's recorded some input, and he's sort of using that to control time. And possibilities for visualization that I just think have not been considered yet. And if we work on that, and this is part of why I'm interested in virtual reality, partly, virtual reality offers at least a few new ways of visualizing things and interacting with things. Okay, so if there's new methods of visualization, that means that there are more simulations that can be visualized. Okay, but finally you sort of say, well, but simulations are really quite complicated things in which you have, a bunch of stuff happening. You've got these sophisticated rules. You have maybe some exceptional cases. It's really hard to learn all that stuff. It's hard enough. If you import somebody else's code, then you've got to learn, like, okay, they've defined like this protein and that protein, and they're modeling this one as a sphere, but they have like some little dip in it or something like that. And that's quite difficult and complicated. But essentially, this is a task that the video games industry has had for a while. A video game, and as you get more towards simulations that people are interacting with, you're getting closer to what you might call a video game, because it is okay. There's something that you're trying to achieve inside of a simulation on your computer. That's very similar to a person in a video game trying to defeat a boss, trying to kill a dragon or something like that, right? It's seriously. So this is a serious analogy, and it's a really strong analogy. I'm not even saying they're like vaguely connected. I'm saying they're almost the same thing. Trying to get a phenomenon to emerge from a simulation and trying to get something done in a video game. And if you're going to try and do this, if you're going to try and present people with a simulation and try to get them to understand the simulation purely by playing with it, it doesn't hurt to take a look at video games. Also, it sounds ridiculous, but like, you know, why should scientists have to spend so much time writing? If our skills are in mathematics and in rigor and all this stuff, and writing is something that we have to do every once in a while. Okay, I can draw in the analogy. If you feel like reading novels to get better at writing for writing your scientific papers, it doesn't hurt to look at some video games to get better at designing simulations to present your simulations to people. And just a few lessons here, where there's a phase where people learn the controls of the video game. When people are playing a video game, they start out, they're trying to learn the controls, which is, for us analogous, they have to learn what the free variables of a simulation are, like what you can control. People look for win and loss conditions, and then they look for strategies. And that's kind of analogous to looking at what are the metrics of a simulation, what are the outputs, and a winning strategy is kind of analogous to a emergent phenomenon. And then another thing that happens in a video game is that tasks can be arranged such that the easy tasks are at the beginning, they increase in complexity, and finally, controlling attention is a difficult and important thing for a video game developer. And sound effects and flashing colors are a powerful method to do it. And so, yeah, there's one thing here called Earth, a primer. It's a sort of video game about geology. You can do things like manipulate where sand goes. You can see how rain affects the development of mountains. You can see how tectonic plates affect each other. It's very, very interesting, and sort of bridges this gap between a video game and a scientific simulation that you might want to find out some science from. Okay, and there I will end it. Okay. Bit crazy, I know, but yeah, I'm going to get rid of those. There were various things that people brought up. Should we go through those?
Well, thank you first of all for presenting it all and thinking about it. So I'm still waiting to hear the answer to that question.
Okay.
How did you end up joining my group?
No.
I'm still curious to know.
It's because I was interested in. It's theoretical, and it's an approach to biology that comes out with testable results. Testable predictions. It is at least partly something that can be visualized. And yeah, I thought that my skills in graphics and creating systems might have been useful.
Right.
That's not exactly turned out to be the case, but it is. But this is meant to be something that sort of brings together. With the virtual reality stuff, I've been interested in different ways of interacting with a computer, and I do think that is something that's of use. It's hard to see right now, but that's something that may be of use to the biology community, because biology does happen in 3 dimensions, right? Lamps is in 3 dimensions, and yeah, I thought I'd be visualizing a bunch of things, and the kinetical thing did sort of make sense. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So I don't know. Do you guys wanna say something?
We discussed a bunch of things previously about this stuff. So mostly. So I was talking to Hamish about that there is a lot of economics in this. Why, for example, software industry and science industry, albeit very similar in what he has shown behave very differently and like have different niches and so on. Mostly because like economics of science and economics of software or video games are different, and people. So like we know like in everyday life, economics is the most underground thing,
The most real one.
the most real one. Yeah. So
The most what?
Most real.
Most real.
I mean so like politics and rules and stuff like that. It all just masking some fundamental like economical thing that, for example, what is profitable for like society, what so it's somehow the balance between resources and outcome between different tasks. So for example, like
Introduction from capital.
yeah, like
Marx.
Going into like straight examples. So we were talking about how it would be nice for people to understand your papers, but as long
Papers is
as
not about
understanding
communication.
of papers is not something that scientists are paid for, but more, for example, like impact factors of what they are publishing, that is not the same. It means that they won't spend so much time making the papers nice and easy.
Yeah, I did. This wasn't in the presentation when I showed it to you, was it?
It wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? He's actually got, so Carl Jensen, he's Caltech, electron microscopist, he's important in electron microscopy. He did, I think I once saw you, Andrew, talking about the full cell. He had an entire E. coli that he did the electron microscopy to, and he had the ribosomes were visible, yeah.
Okay.
Which was, and so it's that guy, and so you might say, this is a person who has, well, this is a person whose main interest is to, did find it to be economical to produce this 20-minute video.
Sure.
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. And I'd be completely willing to accept that this is quite a pathological thing. But at the same time,
like,
there's some hope.
Promoting your own work is in many like cases very important thing for scientists
We are
because
living in a world with market.
so and it definitely is going to like be changing for good that like with this like social presence, media and stuff like that, and that you need to be very communicative and you need to somehow reach a broader audience. For example, to win some money from government, you should be able to show that you can communicate your own work to people, and that's why there will be more and more people who, for example, produce this kind of stuff, and maybe they will have like this. In your funding applications, they will have this kind of paragraph devoted like for how much videos of this stuff you produced.
To say it again though, this is not outreach. I'm pretty sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
as in, this is a video made by a scientist for scientists.
Yeah, but the government wants us exactly to talk to the masses.
It's true. Yeah.
Rather than to other scientists.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that should be spoken about, maybe even on like high levels, and people who try to like write the rules of how this academia stuff is working, because like people on the like base of this pyramid, they will be doing something that is more profitable to them, in sort of like, if it's like writing a lot of papers, it will be a lot of papers. If it's like making a lot of videos about research, it will be videos about research and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that the whole community of like scientific and also the community of people generally will benefit greatly if that more understanding and less just just blind references and blind citations will be around, yeah, but like it's something that we're still need to see in the future.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to make any future predictions, but I would say that if you had some big publication and okay, I've got to submit a PDF to this journal, okay, fine, I'll do that. If it didn't hurt to make a web page where people could see it, I bet that scientists would prefer to look at that web page because they're like, I don't have to go. I know I'm not going to have to go through a paywall. I know I'm not going to have to go through something like this. Well,
this is happening. Yeah. So one journal was bugging me that they want to hear my opinion exactly. They want to introduce applets in their publications where you can drag sliders and
interesting.
so that the plots can rebuild themselves in real life.
What journal was that?
It's not a
very not an important one.
Not for a record.
Not a very important journal.
Okay.
No. They are called Faculty of Thousand Research. All right. So I didn't have time to answer to that. Obviously, applicability of that is very limited, right? Because what you seem to confuse is the difference between simulation and visualization. So these are two very different things. So most of the time we're talking about visualization, right?
You reckon this is all just visualization?
Well, most of it was a visualization rather than anything else, right? So like these polygons, for example, was absolutely beautiful tool, right? But on the background of it was extremely simple stuff going on, right? But the interface that they created for people to interact with is extremely beautiful, right? It's just like things are animated and they are moving and they are making faces at you and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, all that thing does is called phase separation, which is on a lattice, right? So which means it's like a Ising model, right? That an undergraduate student in the physics department can program, right?
It's true.
So,
okay.
You see what I mean, right? So sometimes you can create beautiful visualization which really helps to understand the concept, right?
But you still get outputs from your models, right? All of you guys. You get, I mean...
the tools of visualization, in my opinion, are absolutely critical for people like us to ourselves to understand what's happening. This is what I'm trying to tell to you guys, that whenever you do something, the most important question, how do you interrogate the results of what I have simulated, right? And that's pretty much most of the time is the most important thing, right? Sometimes whether you find something or not depends on how sort of smart or how resourceful you are in sort of pulling things out, right? Or what you have simulated. I mean, my PhD thesis was an example of that, right? So it also highlights the difference, right, between the game industry and the science, right? Because in the game industry, you can only get whatever behavior that the people already programmed for you, right? If it's a game of life, it's a different story, right? Then, of course, you are sort of touching on science here, right? Because that's what it is. It's a cellular automaton.
Yes.
Right? However, in most cases, these complicated games that kids play on the cell phones, right? This is just
puzzles. sort of puzzles.
Bunch of rules that are being implemented for you. So at best, you can master some sort of strategies which are already programmed in. So the difference is that you hope when you run your simulation that you will actually pull out of it something which you didn't encode in it, right?
I'm gonna show you something that I'm hoping will be at least a little bit of a surprise. So
Okay.
this is a really so the World of Goo is a video game. Once again, it's got a good visual interface to sell it, but okay. If I just go for this one, okay. So simple thing, you can create these sort of scaffoldings. And there's, it's springs. It's points connected by springs in 2 dimensions. With some extra little factors. Okay, the game of life is not the only example of a game, a thing that is called a game, that has non-trivial emergent behavior. And not only is that the case for this game, but every single level does something different with the sort of mechanics of the game. So a simple example is, okay, this was something where you were hanging. You also build bridges. You've got to build something that goes over but does not touch a thing here. It is really quite interesting. You're absolutely right that cell phone games, Bejeweled, Candy Crush, etc., Angry Birds, are not of any interest to a scientist. But there are other examples that I can cite. There's a parabola.
Maybe they are.
Well, Candy Crush, I can tell you.
I suppose a lot of scientists spend time
no, right.
playing these games.
That's not what I'm... Yes. Of interest to... they have non-trivial emergent behavior. Really. Honestly. Really, really.
Yeah, no, that's possible. That's possible, right? Yeah. But what I'm saying is that what exactly? Yeah.
So, what's the relevance? Like, I really would claim that by playing something like this, you come to understand how humans can understand simulations. You come to this game teaches you about its simulation in a quite clever and sophisticated way, and that's what I claim. And again, it's a very easily visualized thing. I mean, the outputs that you guys get, so you do look at your, well, obviously you plot graphs, right? Or you maybe look at phase space.
All sorts of things.
All sorts of things. But then you cut a lot of it out for the paper, right? Is that
That's
right?
inevitable, yeah. That's
Ah, well, why is it inevitable? Does it have to be inevitable? I mean, wouldn't it be nice if...
I would say paper is not a way of communication now.
Oh.
It's like I disagree from the beginning. So, if you want, and it's definitely not a way of communication. It's definitely not a way of not a part of educational processes. Because if you want to learn something in the book, if you want to really teach somebody, you write a book.
To Wikipedia.
Or you write a book. So people do not write books now. I mean, they publish because publication is a kind of value. I mean, corrupted scheme. But I mean, it's now publication is not a way of communication. It's a kind of statement, and you observe it earlier than different people, for example. It's a way of. So it's.
But no.
I mean, it's not. It's not a way of communication because you.
Everyone, you are supposed to communicate your results. That's true. But
I mean, you just say, and that's why.
Have you find some papers that you weren't you are searching for papers
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I do. I mean,
So if
yeah.
it's not a method of communication, why you search for
It's
pages?
not the only purpose of publication. It's not the
Uh,
main
it's-
purpose.
it's-
It's not the main purpose
it's-
of publication.
Ah.
Because otherwise, it will be definitely it will be kind of HTML file with the videos, with the code, interaction, and whatever
Yeah.
you want.
or all of your
And the
This
question
is exactly the point.
The question is, like, you get all this and you say, okay, what do I do, right?
Mhm.
Take me through it, right? And that's what paper is supposed to do. Paper is supposed to take you through all these games, right?
It's like
And-
tutorial.
And in the end of that,
That's what I'm
you
saying.
should come out and say, oh, I think I know what they're talking about, right?
Yes.
So now I think it's assumed that that reader already aware about this notations. I don't know, literature.
Well,
and-
some types of papers are worse than others, right? So, like physicists, for example, they're really bad, and there are journals like
Because it's a format. I mean, you cannot struggle with the format of presenting, right? You
like
cannot
Journal
just-
of Chemical Physics, for example, right? They, when I read their papers, I always think, what the hell? I mean, what is this paper about, right? So you try the abstract, okay, you looked at the title, all right, maybe interesting. You try to read the abstract, no, I still don't understand. Then you read the introduction, still don't understand. Then you read at the end the conclusion. And in the end, what do I